All right, good afternoon and welcome to today's Capital One Teachable Tuesday webinar, co-sponsored by CoSIDA and the N4A. We are pleased to offer a discussion on LGBTQ plus inclusion initiatives in college athletics. Part 1, the administrator point of view. This is part 1 of the discussion and will follow with a part 2 webinar next Tuesday, which will feature the views of student athlete panelists. Today, we have 4 phenomenal panelists that will engage in a thoughtful conversation. I am Resa Lovelace, the Assistant AD of Student Athlete Development at the University of Maryland, and I will serve as the webinar moderator. We appreciate you joining us today. So before we begin, we would like to say a quick thank you to corporate partner Capital One, presenting sponsor of CoSIDA's Continuing Education Series. As a reminder, the on-demand webinar will be posted later today on CoSIDA.com and CoSIDA's YouTube channel. We also will have this as a podcast, and you'll be able to download it from the services listed on CoSIDA.com. Please invite your colleagues to listen and watch the on-demand webinar, as it is free to everyone. Thank you to all who have submitted questions in advance, and we encourage you to submit any questions you might have. Place them in the chat box and your questions will be addressed throughout the webinar. So as I mentioned, we have 4 esteemed panelists who are ready to engage in an inclusive and thoughtful conversation. So let's meet our 4 phenomenal panelists. So in alphabetical order, we have Aimee Huchthausen, the Commissioner of America East Conference, Layne Ingram, President's Office Project Coordinator and Women's Basketball Coach of Lansing Community College, Aimee Sinacola, a Sports Information Director at Indiana University at South Bend, and Gary Pine, the Director of Athletics at Azusa Pacific University. So panelists, let's just jump into this conversation. Today we're here to talk about LGBTQ plus and college athletics. So what brought you to the table and why is this conversation important to the industry today? Layne, you want to jump in first?
Sure. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm here because what we do, what we say, it matters. It matters, and we're in positions where we can make the difference, and we can change lives with our support. I'm from Lansing, Michigan, and in 2017, I came out as transgender, and that was life changing, and it was big, and LCC was a big part of that. And so I'm here because I like to share some of the things that we've done at LCC, share what my experiences have been like, and also kind of talk from the student athlete point of view in terms of how we can support them, and make this, kind of make everything more inclusive, make it better all around campus wide.
I'll go with that, Resa, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. Give you a little bit of background on me. I'm the Director of Athletics at Azusa Pacific, which is an NCAA Division II school out in Southern California. It is a faith-based school. I'm a man of deep faith. It's a driving force in my daily life. I'm also on the leadership team of Common Ground, which is an NC2A initiative to bring together people of faith and people of the LGBT community to find the common ground. I think it's fairly obvious that in our past as a country and as a culture, those have been 2 divergent people groups that have not intermingled. And so I've been a part of that project for the last 7 years, 6-7 years, and it has been a very impactful activity or involvement for me in terms of learning how to have conversations with people who think differently, live differently, see the world differently, and to find the abilities to sit at a table together and to put our cards on the table and to find those areas where we do have common ground. And so this conversation's I'll say it's fascinating now, but I'll be honest, when I entered into it 6-7 years ago, I entered in with a great deal of trepidation and of fear. Some of it because of what I see in the media, some of it just because of my own personal fears and which I think are common to all people. but it has been very transformative in my life to be a part of this conversation, to expose myself to difficult and challenging conversations and yet see the rewards of those. And so that's why I'm here today and looking forward to where this goes over the next hour.
Gary, I'll piggyback off that one. Thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure. Like Resa said, I am the Sports Information Director at Indiana University South Bend, an NAI school in South Bend, Indiana. I got here because a colleague and friend of mine, Katie Gonzalez, another SID from Illinois Wesleyan, reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to be a part of the panel. Having been a former student athlete at a very religious school, Liberty University, I wasn't comfortable with who I was or exploring who I was and coming out because of the beliefs and values of the university. And on top of that, I was also raised in a very religious Baptist home. So I was very afraid of figuring out who I was and coming out. And it's also in an area, I'm from West Michigan, Grand Rapids area, and at the time wasn't or still isn't very inclusive or LGBT friendly. So all of that was really hard for me to come out and to be accepting of who I was. So I felt, you know, I was afraid, and I finally came out about 5 years ago. And now here I am, and that's why I have a passion for what I do. I want to, now that I'm an openly gay female working in college athletics, I want to be that role model for the next generation of student athletes. I want to be a sounding board for them if they ever need to talk about something, and just to create that welcoming space in athletics.
And I will go last and share a little bit about why I think I'm part of this conversation. I appreciate the invitation, just like the fellow panelists mentioned, to be part of this conversation. It's one that I embrace and, you know, welcome any opportunity to talk about LGBT plus inclusion, because I think it's so important, both personally to me and then also professionally as we think about all of the student athletes and coaches and staff and administrators that we serve. At a very critical point in the lives, as Aimee just talked about, being a college student and struggling with some of this stuff. You know, we have a great opportunity, probably the best opportunity, to reach young people through athletics and talk about so many different things. But LGBT plus inclusion to me is really, really important for all of the struggles that individuals have as they come to sort of embrace themselves as they, you know, emerge into adulthood and what have you. I feel really fortunate to have the position that I have as commissioner of the Americas Conference, which is a Division I conference based in Boston. Our schools are primarily in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. To work with a group of schools, presidents, athletic directors, you know, coaches, student athletes, and, you know, particularly in this part of the country that we live in, that is generally a little bit more progressive, quite candidly, and open to some of these things. That has allowed us as a conference to really move forward. We've been working on LGBTQ plus inclusion now for over 6 years, I think, maybe even 7 years, as a conference initiative. And to see that continue to grow and not be just a 1 year, one shot deal has been really impactful, I know, to our institutions, to our community that we serve, and then also to the young people and people in their campus community. So like I said, I feel really blessed and fortunate to work with a league where we can really dive into some of these issues and support them, support our student athletes, and be able to talk about it now, like I said, 6 or 7 years later, to, I think, be one of the, you know, leaders, at least in Division I from a conference perspective, to be doing this in a pretty robust way.
So you all talked varying about how we are supporting our student athletes. I want to take it a little step further, and Aimee Huchthausen, I want to start with you because you have done a lot of work with your conference in regards to supporting your LGBTQ plus student athletes. But can you give us a little bit more, and how does this also support the staff and coaches at those institutions with the campaign you all have?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, that as a conference with, you know, 9 institutions for a while now, 10 institutions, there's only so much that the conference can do, right? Because our touch points with our student athletes and coaches and staff is fairly infrequent at the end of the day. And the real work and dialogue has to happen on campus. But I firmly believe that a conference that embraces this conversation and these issues provides the overall umbrella environment to have those conversations on campus. I really do believe that that is important, to know that if you're at school A, to know that school B is having that same conversation, that you can work together, because this is not a one campus or one community problem or issue. This is something that collaboration and partnership and allyship across schools within a league, I think, is so important. So, you know, what is it meant for our community and all the different stakeholders? You know, one is our student athletes, who are very active on social media, are active, engaged, willing participants in all the different social media campaigns that we run, whether it's, you know, using a hashtag or posting photos during Pride Month or during our Spread Respect games that we have during basketball season. You know, to be maybe a student athlete who is uncomfortable with themselves, doesn't know, is still exploring, or to be that like 10-year-old kid in the stands who went to the volleyball match or basketball game with their family, to see student athletes, both men and women, straight, gay, and everyone on that spectrum, you know, being visible with their support, I think is so critical. And I think that's where conference campaigns or conference efforts can be so important. That visibility, you know, it might be a t-shirt and a hashtag on the one hand, that's like one very small tangible item, but the power that that has is truly remarkable. To know that you can just look up, even if you're uncomfortable using your voice or you haven't found your voice yet, to see that and know that once you are able to use your voice or want to start doing that, that you're going to have support in your athletics department and your team, I think is like, cannot underscore the importance of that in helping a student athlete work through that process during their 4 or 5 years on a campus.
Thank you for that. Does anybody else want to address how you're being inclusive within your staff, student athletes, and coaches?
The only other thing I wanted to say to what Aimee said was, I think also when it comes from the conference level, it kind of shows that the conference isn't going to stand for anything less than people being treated the way that they should be treated, you know. And so from that level, there's also accountability on the schools, on the behavior that the conference won't accept. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I want to, you know, kind of continue to talk about, you know, support, right? Support comes in many forms. Support comes in the form of education. And I know, Layne, you mentioned this in your opening, just what you're doing there at Lansing. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you're taking on this education with your specific institution?
Yeah, we as the basketball coach, and you know, I work in the president's office, so that gives me kind of the unique ability to be able to do things college-wide. And so what I was really proud to do was an event that we called Full Court Pride, right? Because when you think about doing events for QIA plus, you think about Pride Month, you think about you know, Trans Awareness Week in November, you think about the ones you must hit, right? Like that's the basic foundation. We have to do that. And so I would suggest that if possible, like Aimee was saying, that you do add an event when you can by sport. And so for basketball, we came up with Full Court Pride, and it was about partnering with the community, but also doing something that we hadn't done, maybe making some people a little uncomfortable, but making sure that we showed that our athletic department was unified behind this community, and that we support this marginalized community. So, you know, she brought up t-shirts, but both of our basketball teams, their warm-up shirts our logo was changed to rainbow colors. And so you think about, you know, maybe even some of the men's basketball players, women's basketball players that maybe didn't want to do that, they all did. You know, all the coaches did that. It was kind of a singular effort to show that as an athletic department, we are inclusive, we are welcoming, and we're inviting. And so, you know, that would be your standard event. You know, you got speakers and you have giveaways. But we invited people from the community to say, you know, this is kind of a day to raise awareness, connect with others, and meet the team. And so I was proud to do that. It was really well received. I mean, we also have a group on campus called Prism, and I'm the chair of that group, and it's for employees. And so we make a lot of we put a lot of effort into developing activities where people can connect, but also we take a lot of time to make sure that people's preferred names are what they're supposed to be, right? That we're using the correct pronouns, that they understand that they have an avenue for how to do that stuff. Because if we can create an environment where everybody feels welcome, right, we're doing something right. So those are a couple of things that we're doing. I mean, we have to continue to get better.
Thank you for that. And both Aimee and Layne touched on, how we're promoting this at games. And I love that Aimee Sinacola is with us today, from a sports information director position, right? Like, everybody always wants to tell the story of our student athletes and the great things that they're doing on the court. But how do we share these stories from the lens of our student athletes potentially coming out, or as I like to say, inviting in? So Aimee, from your seat, how can we help, our other sports information directors kind of share the stories of our student athletes?
Yeah, so one of the biggest reasons why I got into sports info and why I love what I do is because we're in that place to tell the student athlete story. Like any personal interest story, it's our job to provide a platform for the student athletes to be able to share, their personal struggles, their perseverance stories, or their personal victories. I believe that's important in order to tell that, or to tell our coming out stories, or whatever that might be for our athlete. It's important to find out the athlete's, I guess, quote unquote, why. And then it's our job, or my job as sports information directors, to support that and to portray that why the best way that we can possibly. There's many whys, right? Every why looks different. It could be doing it because maybe they didn't have, someone before them to look up to, and they want to be that person for the younger generations. Someone like myself, per se, that might be my why. They want to show other athletes that it's not only okay to be who you are, but to be proud of who you are. This gives a sense of connectivity between all our student athletes and the younger generations and people around them. Another reason why might be maybe they want to share or show everyone that they, I guess, conquered their fear of coming out. For me, again, I was afraid to come out because of where I was and the people I was surrounded by. So that's, that's, the athletes don't want to be ashamed of who they are anymore. So again, that might be another reason. Being proud of who you are and conquering something is also like an example. There's a lot of stories that are on social media of student athletes that, have struggled with injuries, right? Like, people love the comeback stories. So that's another reason, or how we can share that as sports information directors. Another reason for a why for a student athlete might be, they just want to use sport as a platform. They're comfortable with, their avenue of playing, but then they're also comfortable with who they are. And so they use both of those platforms for, we can use both of those platforms to promote their stories. And like Aimee said, social media is so powerful now in today's world with technology, and using, things such as hashtags to get people more involved, to generate more content or more visuals on what we're putting out there. But yeah, I think the most important way to show those stories is to get the why, to really understand our student athletes, because that's really important. And I think as an administrator at a university level, it also shows that our university is inclusive and supportive of our student athletes, whatever that story might be. And again, for me personally, my why is my story and me being comfortable with who I am and where I was as a student athlete. And I just want to be that same person for our student athletes.
Aimee, that's awesome. You gave us a lot of best practices, and so I'm going to switch gears here. And what are some of the best practices you've all seen work among teammates and the athletic department personnel when it comes to members with varying viewpoints regarding LGBTQ plus matters. Gary, I'm gonna have you jump in here on that one.
Sure. Yeah, glad to. Boy, this is a lengthy answer. I'm going to see if I can be succinct in it, because this is there's a real challenge in all of this. We've heard the language. We've heard people talk about how polarized we are as a society, as a culture, and we are, politically, socially, economically, and we all have our identity groups in which we put ourselves in. We even see it within our athletic departments. And the truth of the matter is how do we enact change? How do we enact a greater sense of unity and less polarization? And we have that going on greatly here. I think one of the things that I have learned is the conversation, having conversations with student athletes as an AD, having one-on-one conversations. And the challenge is, how do you start those conversations? They're very difficult to do. Aimee talked about a fear. And I think we all have a built-in fear wherever you are on the spectrum of this issue. There is a fear of, do I say anything? And what do I say? And how do I say it? And how do I start a conversation? It has been interesting, our work in Common Ground. And kudos to Aimee Wilson of the NC2A, who has done a lot to put this together, along with Pat Griffin, who's been a pioneer. And I might mention Skip Lord of Houghton College, who's been a significant part of this. One of the things that we've learned is just to have conversations, to be able to allow people to ask questions and to answer questions as boldly as possible, and to not react to those answers or to those questions. And a lot of them are always why. Why do you believe this? Why do you do this? Why do you see it this way? And I think for 18, 19, 20-year-olds, those are hard conversations to have. There's a maturity factor about that. But it is interesting, two Ivy League professors, I want to say it's about 10 years ago, maybe longer than that, started doing a study as to what causes people to change their minds. Why do people change their minds, and what are the forces that do that? And one of the things they learned is that every day we change our mind 1,000 times. I'm going to sit in this chair or sit in that chair. I'm going to have this for lunch or this for lunch. Am I going to drive in this lane, drive in that lane? They discovered in this study of change that we make changes all the time. But when it comes to our identities and our securities, we don't make change. We lock in to who we are and what we've become to know, whether it's being a student athlete, whether it's being any other identity that we connect to. What they discovered is that change comes through relationship, and that change, when it comes to some level of my identity and who I am, happens through lengthened relationships and lengthened conversations, and entering into relationships with people. And so I think one of the important things for me as an administrator, as an athletic director at Azusa Pacific, is to enter into conversations with our student athletes one-on-one or small group, and earn trust. Trust is real important in all of this. And I think that's where fear comes from, is a lack of trust. And I think that's legitimate. That's not a criticism of anyone with fear in this. The fear is real, it's legitimate. But how do you enter into these conversations, overcome the fear, and how do you develop trust to where you can have conversations that really begin to enact thought and change? Those are challenging, and I think for administrators who may be a little bit farther years in their advance, and I'm probably one of the older people who are involved in this conversation today. It takes some time, it takes some wisdom to be able to develop those skills. But I would encourage people to enter into conversations, to enter into relationships that allow trust to be built, and then to be sensitive in those conversations that allow for certain questions to be asked and for certain answers to be given, and for there not to be criticism, judgment, preaching, and this desire to change people like this. And I think that's one of our challenges in our country right now, particularly on a political spectrum. We want to change people now, and that's not human nature, and it's not what science has told us happens with change. So lengthy answer. sorry for being a little long-winded on that, but that's, I would say, conversation and relationships and having the courage to step forward in those are key elements.
That's awesome, Gary. It looks like we're getting a lot of questions from our audience. So I'm gonna throw some of these questions at you all. First one is, how do we move the needle for LGBTQA+ inclusivity for student athletes and staff alike in an athletics atmosphere hinged on traditional values?
Hire Gary Pine. No.
Well,
I mean, I will say I've had the opportunity to attend one of the Common Ground sessions, and I was blown away by the level of dialogue and the trust that was established in just a couple of days. I mean, they're not very long sessions, right? And I approached that with the trepidation and sort of hesitation around what I was walking into, because I really had no idea other than the theme of the event. But that reminded me just how important it is to approach it in the way that Gary said, these conversations. It's all in the approach, and establish a human connection with people, regardless if you walk in knowing that you may have very fundamentally different beliefs on issue A or issue B. And obviously, in the purposes for the context of this conversation, it's around LGBTQ+ identity and and things of that nature. But you know, we're all people at the end of the day, and if you can just approach it with a little bit of empathy and kindness, and not with the attempt, like Gary said, to change someone's mind, but to more just like embrace their heart. That it like sounds like a little corny, but it's so true, and that's all that people want, I think, is to feel connected. Not, you know, I think people at their base want to feel loved, but even if we can't get that far, just to feel safe and trusted and be connected to a trusting person that they know is going to respect them, even if they disagree or have different viewpoints. And it's like so fundamental to us as humans and creatures on this earth. But that's how you approach it, I think. These can be really complicated issues and matters, and we can, because we're humans, and we can spin up all sorts of different scenarios to complicate things. At the end of the day, I think people just want to feel safe. And if we can do that, I think that is the fundamental objective in these conversations, even if we come from the other person that we're speaking to, or the environment that we're at our particular institution is traditional or faith-based, or whatever the sort of foundation is of that community. I would hope that all of us in higher education are approaching our students and the education of our students with that top of mind.
I think all that.
Jump in. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just think, just quick, I think all that takes time too, right? Like, I mean, just like relationships and things like that, even in my own personal experiences, even family stuff, like that just takes time, and it takes conversations and just being real with people. And, you know, my relationships with people at Liberty still to this day, I just feel comfortable. You know, the university as a whole might not be doing things, but the people that I know and the relationships that I've developed with those people in administration, that's what makes me feel good. And I know at some point, again, things take time, and at some point, hopefully, that needle will slowly begin to move.
I was just gonna say, back to Aimee H. I loved what you said when you thought you were being corny. You know, that's why I wore this shirt that says "Love Wins," because it's a reminder, right? Like, if you've been in a marginalized community, if you've had to come out, if you've ever, have struggled with who you are or have been rejected, right? Like, love, right? When you can tell that somebody's coming at you from a place where they actually care, that makes a difference. And something that Gary said about kind of the environment, how changing people overnight, there are small things that you can do overnight that might seem small, right? But it gives a student athlete or a person kind of an inside look that, oh, maybe I can trust this person. Like, think about your email signature, right? Like, if you put your pronouns in there, that's like a really quick, like, that person gets it, right? Mm-hmm. Or what kind of things are around your campus right now, right? Like, there's safe zone stickers. I mean, there's little things that can give that students are looking for to let them know that they're in a safe place, or that the person that they're talking to is somebody that, you know, might understand. So that just popped into my head.
Real quick, I'll try to share a story here from the first Common Ground that I was ever a part of back in 2014. A group of about 40 people. We were going around the tables standing up and introducing ourselves. And I was very nervous. I knew I had kind of scouted out. I was one of about 6 or 7 people of faith that were there. I knew I was about one of 5 people that was straight. And so when I got up and introduced myself, I was pretty nervous of how do I introduce myself and how do I identify myself, for fear of rejection. I think that's one of the things that's around this whole subject matter. So I introduced myself and then sat down. 2 people at my table, 2 people later, a lady stood up and introduced herself, and she said, "I hate white men." And I was the only white person that had said anything at that point, and I was the only man at that point who had said anything. I take it back, I was the only white male to say anything. And you heard an audible gasp in the room. And when she was done, she sat down, and I reached across the table and said, "Hey, you and we need to talk." And she says, "You and me?" I go, "Yeah." She goes, "Okay." And as soon as she said okay, in my mind, I went, "Holy cow, what have I done?" I mean, because I didn't know what to say. I don't know why I even asked that question, "We need to talk." But 56 hours later, we sat down and talked. We'd kind of gotten to know each other in some of our small groups actions. And sat down, and first thing I said is, "Hey, why do you hate me?" She says, "Gary, I don't hate you." But then she began to tell her story about why she struggled with white men. And as she unfolded and told that story, I began to understand why she had come to that conclusion. And she and I have a friendship now. We're very different, extremely different. But if I were to see her, I'd run up and give her a hug right now, and we'd sit down and talk. But it came back to a point of being vulnerable, of having some trust, asking a question, and beginning to build off of that. Now, granted, as I said before, I think that's hard for college age students, but I want to encourage them to begin to be able to enter into dialogues and ask questions. And I think one of the things I've learned is getting comfortable at being uncomfortable. And as a society, we move to our corners where we're most comfortable. We crave comfort in this culture. I think if we're ever going to see any change in here, we've got to learn how to be comfortable at being uncomfortable, and that means engaging in conversations that are difficult and challenging, but with respect and with an honor and a dignity to whoever we might be having that conversation with across the table.
Gary, you just mentioned about being vulnerable in the space. And so another question from my audience member is, do you all find it important to come out to coworkers or administrators? This person has said, "I've always struggled on deciding whether or not to do so."
I'll go first. I mean, I think it's important, but I also think it's a personal choice, and it depends on also what kind of coming out. You know, for me, I was going to be changing kind of significantly. I mean, if you even look down at that image that's in the flyer, it don't look like that, you know? And so that was going to be important for me to let people know. And thankfully, I was in a place where it was well accepted and we coordinated around it. One thing I kind of want to circle back on that is that this also makes me like a walking billboard, right? So people that don't know me, I'm at the point in my transition where you wouldn't know. If you saw me on the street, you would have no idea, I hope, right? But that's a fine line, because I also want to make sure that people do know, you know. So if you were there during the transition, when I walk into the room, I'm a reminder that there's different people in your space, and we need to make sure that that we keep that in mind. And so I think that when you come out, one, it helps to educate people, right? Like, you're still the same you. They just know something a bit more about you, and that helps them learn. And so I think that it was positive for me, and I understand that it's not like that for everybody. And so that's why when I walk into a room, I want to be a reminder that when I'm here, you're going to be okay. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Layne, for that. Does anybody else want to take a stab at that conversation?
I've also, as Layne said, I think it coming out at the end of the day is a personal individual choice about what that person feels comfortable with. I would hope that someone never feels pressure to come out, because that leads to a whole series of other issues and challenges for that person. And, you know, I hope people are never forced to come out or outed, as they say, because that also is not helpful to anyone. But I think certainly to have visible, identifiable coaches, staff, student athletes, administrators who are out, you know, supports all the things that we've been talking about having visible role models, visible allies, and that sort of thing. But I've always sort of struggled with, you know, as people talk about, oh, there's only this many out administrators or ADs or coaches in this sport or that sport. Like, okay, well, what does that really mean? Just because someone had a press conference or had a press release about it, that's how we're measuring out. That's a really poor metric in my mind. And that's not the way that we should be measuring whether someone is comfortable in their own skin or is out to their team. There are a lot of coaches who are out to their teams, right? But they don't, and they may or may not have that listed in their biography on their website. Again, that's all to me, what that person feels comfortable with based on all of the conditions and factors in that person's environment. It really, I don't think ever hurts. Once someone's ready, I think I hope that people would embrace it, and that leads to good things. But I hope that people never feel pressure to do that. I think it absolutely is an individual choice.
Thank you for that, Aimee. Another question from our audience is, with all the social justice focus and work on racial injustices right now, as it should be, how do you continue to make sure not to forget about other social injustices and put in the hard work for LGBT inclusion?
I think it's hard in general right now. About a month ago, I shared with some people that I felt like I was going through several things, you know, all that, like a trifecta of things, right? We have the pandemic going, we have the racial injustice. I felt like that as a Black man, right? And then you have the LGBT part, just as a trans person. And I felt just like a tornado of things at a certain point, you know, right around George Floyd. And so, no, we don't, you know, I definitely think it's about balancing, you know, but it goes back to, right, like who needs the most support when? Everybody needs support. We all do. We can never forget it. But it's all intermingled, you know, when you talk about this is maybe 60 years since Stonewall, you know what I mean? I mean, that was two groups together in that riot. And so I think we have to remember that as marginalized groups, you know, like we're all fighting for the same thing, which is equality. And so, you know, while there might be a spotlight on one thing right now, right, we all are still in the fight. And if one of us, you know, gets some help, it helps the other. And so we have to, that's kind of how I'm looking at it and how I worked myself through that trifecta of the fiasco that we're in right now.
Yeah, I would agree with Layne. I actually read, I have read a couple articles where it has this conversation, and different authors or columnists try to pit like one marginalized group against another marginalized group. And I'm like, I sure hope people aren't taking that bait, because it's it's like a false narrative, and it's a false sort of argument that people are trying to craft, in my opinion. I think I completely agree with what Layne said about marginalized people or underrepresented groups binding together. And I actually just read a book. I don't know who reads Zadie Smith or is familiar with the author Zadie Smith, but she's like a brilliant writer. And she just released in the last like couple of weeks or month or so, a series of short essays that she wrote since March, since the pandemic, and she flipped it out and published it. And the book is called Intimations. But the very last essay is around the virus, and it's not the virus of the pandemic that the coronavirus that she's talking about. It's a virus of racism. And towards the end there, she talks about how really to overcome racism or any form of discrimination against a targeted group, it's really going to require the collection of marginalized people, the collection of underrepresented people to come together and work together, because clearly we've not been able to do it in the history of our country as segmented groups. And so the sooner, my interpretation of her essay was the sooner all of these groups or more of these groups combine together, the sooner we will start to really make meaningful progress around all types of discrimination. So that's how, that was really compelling to me as I thought about that at this time where we are facing, as Layne described, really, what did you call it, tornado of challenges, with probably more to come. It's only September, and goodness knows what's going to come for the next 3 months before the calendar turns to 2021. But that really resonated with me.
And I think it goes back to, I think it just goes back to, of again, having these conversations, right? Because sometimes we're afraid, we're uncomfortable with the uncomfortable and not knowing, or what we should say, or what we should bring up, or what's more important, right? I think, again, it's just having conversations like this and understanding where all aspects of life people are at, and just being real and having those conversations and understanding everybody and understanding that we all mean something. I think that's the biggest thing.
So I've received a few questions regarding student athletes. So let's kind of jump in here. So can you all share some ideas on how to build an interest for a student athlete gay straight alliance on our campuses, and next steps to create a program from there?
I mean, I think if we were going to do it, everybody that's on the campus, if you're in the athletic department, you're around your athletes. And I don't know, I just say things the way they are. I mean, you either know your athletes well, or you get an idea, or things right, or there's somebody you could reach out to say, what do you think about this, right? Like if it was me, I have a couple student athletes in mind that I'd say, hey, we're thinking of starting this group, right? And the great thing about the kids to me today is that, for the most part, at least where I'm from and who I've been around, things are just okay. I mean, they're not as judgmental. I mean, they're accepting, they're open. They're like, why are you guys being so crazy? And so I don't think that this is a far off idea. And I think that there's lots of colleges that have this specifically for athletes. But I mean, I think it's about asking the question, whatever your way is that you communicate with your athletes, you ask the question and somebody will say yes. I mean, I think that without a doubt. And since that question came up, that's one thing we don't have. We have our regular student, straight and gay alliance for the college, but not student athlete specific. And so that's something that we should even look at, because it is student athletes are a different, they're a different group.
We also have a question that, takes it a little step further with our student athletes, and that is, what is the biggest issue that LGBTQ plus student athletes are currently facing? Some thinking here.
I think it's hard, right? Kind of what Layne was saying. The generation is different. The student athlete generation is different than even when I was in school. I didn't graduate that long ago, but I graduated in 2012, and it was a lot different then. And it's a lot more welcomed. And even my student athletes, oh yeah, that's who Aimee is, right? Aimee's gay. It's just normal, where that was not that way. So it's hard to really grasp, at least from my, like, being a gay female. It's almost, it's not normal, but it's okay, right? Like, it's accepted. And I look at the student athletes now, and I'm not really sure, to be honest. Like, I guess maybe, being welcomed everywhere per se, or they're the teachers or their administrators, maybe them not knowing what they might think, right? Because they're the older generation, and they might not know what they believe or if they support. And I think that goes back to, us as a sports information department, being able to put that out there as our department and as a university, showing that we care about you and we're inclusive and we are a welcome space. So I think that might be hard for student athletes now.
Thank you. Gary, I'm gonna give you this question because
Okay.
I think it fits in with the work that you've done with the Common Ground. And so there's a question in regards to, in an effort to avoid language bias or offending someone, is there agreed upon terminology that supports LGBTQ plus inclusion?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question, Resa, because we have tried to in Common Ground, and I need to find I believe it's on the NC2A website now under the inclusion pages, but we did put together terms and definitions to help people understand what certain things mean. I know for me, I had a lot to learn. Going back to something that I'll say Aimee S. I think we're going Aimee H and Aimee S, but that Aimee S had just talked about. And this is a broad generalization. This is a very broad brush I'm painting with. So don't hold me tight to this. But I do think those who are 40 and over probably wrestle with this issue of LGBTQ and acceptance and acknowledgement more so than those who are 40 and under. And that's pretty general. And so for administrators in athletics who are of my generation, and I'll say I'm 58 years old, I think we're probably behind the curve in understanding language, understanding certain words and the power of them. We're ignorant in that sense, and I don't. That's not a criticism. That's just we haven't been educated, and I have, in entering into this dialogue, have learned a lot about the power of certain words that I was not aware of. That I needed people to help come along and say, hey, Gary, that doesn't work. That's not right. And I think them knowing, oops, I didn't mean to use that language in that way. Although I do think there are people who do know what they're saying and are trying to target and to hurt. But I would encourage people to go to the NC2A inclusion page, and you're going to find Common Ground in there, and then go to the Common Ground page. And I'm pretty sure we put in there words and definitions to help people understand what they mean and what could be harmful and what's not harmful. We even put in phrases in there that can be offensive to certain people groups that we may be unaware of. And so that's a great place to start. In fact, that created some of the best conversations we've ever had. When people said, well, I've heard this question or I've heard this statement before. And people in another identity group will say, well, this is how I hear it. This is how it comes across to me. And we get into some terrific conversations. So I apologize, I don't have that at my fingertips here, but that's knowing phrases and words and how they could be received is a great conversation starter in terms of trying to understand other people's viewpoints.
And I think just since this is a CoSIDA panel, I'm not a communications professional by any stretch of the imagination, but I know that that's your job. And so, you know, I would say go find that resource on the NCA website or any other resource on the proper terms and references, and the same thing on issues of race, because clearly we're dealing with some of that stuff, and we've learned in the last few months, if we didn't know it before, the words we use in that space are also very important and impactful. And even if it's out of ignorance, it can be really harmful to a person or a community. And so, you know, I would develop that sort of protocol or rubric if in your workflow as a communications office. And if you don't have, so that when you hire a coach that might identify as LGBTQ plus, you know how to, you know, talk about that person, you know how to ask questions around, should we include your partner, spouse, wife, husband, what have you, in the release, right? You like get familiar so that if you haven't had to experience that yet, just so that you are prepared. And the same thing if a student athlete wants to tell his or her story or their story or what have you, I think that will show that you as a communications professional are open and willing to like embrace and support that person and their identity in the scope of your job.
All right, so I want to go around the horn for this question. All right, so do you think departments should increase staff for diversity-related offices, similar to how student development offices have been expanded, rather than it being one person? And what will it take for us to get there?
What part of the horn are you starting with, Resa?
Let's go with Layne.
Jeez. Supposed to start with an A or a G? You know, the first thing I saw this question in the chat, and the first thing that popped in my head was, what will they do? Okay. And because we don't want to just throw things at something to say that we did it, right? Like, you know, we've increased the number of people in our diversity office because it matters to us. You know, I mean, what are the real tangible things behind it that will support the need for additional people, right? Like, what's the plan? What are we trying to do? On the other side of it, though, the more people that are trained in diversity, equity, and inclusion, the more people who, you know, maybe understand the issues that face student athletes that work in that type of a setting, that can be helpful. At LCC, we have a chief diversity officer, right? And so that has an office that's overarching for the entire college. And they put on our diversity and inclusion initiatives, right? There hasn't been as much tie-in with the athletic department as there should be, but that doesn't mean that we need a specific person for the athletic department. It means that we need to look at what we're doing and say, you know, where are we at right now? Where do we want to be, right? And how do we get there in between? And so I'd say this is just my own opinion, but before you add people, figure out what it is you want to do, right? And what it's going to take to get there, because there's basic things that need to happen first, right? Like, is your preferred name initiative done, right? Does everybody understand, you know, how to use pronouns? What's your restroom situation looking like? You know, do you have single stalls? What do they say on those doors? I mean, there's little things to do to prepare your environment before, you know, that will help a student walking in the door more than just having another staff person.
Kind of going off of what Layne was talking about, and working at a smaller university where we don't have, you know, the financials to hire more staff. I think if you get in that direction, like Layne was saying, all those other things that you need to get there before just hiring someone else, I think it's important to even get student athletes involved. If you know you have student athletes that are open or willing to be open and to represent something like that, you can create a group where, you know, other student athletes are welcome to join or be that middleman between athletics and their university and as a whole, because we struggle with that here at, you know, a very small university, a satellite campus off of IU. You know, for myself, I'm starting to be more involved in our diversity and inclusion department at the university. So I think, you know, again, coming from a smaller school, it's important for us to bridge that gap between athletics and the university as a whole, and that's how we can do it right now financially. And then just getting student athletes that are, you know, talking to them, and it's like, hey, you want to be more involved? Great. And then eventually building from there.
Yeah, I would echo what Aimee and Layne have said. One of the things I try to do at Azusa Pacific is try to make sure the student athletes are blended in with the university. I try not to separate out with housing, with dining halls, with classes. I want our student athletes to be part of the community there, and I think, you know, the majority of colleges and universities are resource strapped. Very few are part of the Power Five and have other than COVID years, extra income coming in. So it's difficult. I'd be careful about adding people, and to Layne's point, for it being window dressing. It's more about what are you doing and what can you do with what you have. And I do think one of to Aimee's point, that one of the important things to do is get athletics and student athletes engaged in what the university is doing as whole and tied into those resources. I do think student athletes are leaders on campus, and if they're engaged, if you can get them engaged in certain activities, the rest of the campus is more likely to follow along and move in that direction. I think a lot of our colleges and universities have good initiatives and good ideas. They are strapped for personnel, but let's athletics get behind that and move those and open up those doors for engagement.
Yeah, and I clearly we're in a different financial time, and even in normal times, no one in higher education has enough money to do everything that they want. I will submit, just by way of offering a different sort of, but I think complementary point of view, is I do think bigger staffs in this area are important. As we've learned about systemic racism and systemic discrimination across all different groups, there's a reason for that. It's not simply that we have, we're understaffed and inclusion offices, but I don't think it's helped when you think of how big some of these campuses are. Even a smaller private, there are a lot of faculty, staff, students involved even at a small private, let alone a major research university. And if we're really serious about trying to make progress and start to bend towards change, we have to, as an industry, as particular institutions, I think, invest more time, money, resources, and whatever that looks like, given the financial circumstances on any campus. But it can't just be in one person. I think in some cases, what I've seen in higher education or in athletics, where now more athletics departments, at least in Division I, are identifying this person or that person as a diversity officer. I applaud that, but I also am skeptical that it's performative based on the time and circumstances of the last few months. And so I think there needs to be a team, but that doesn't need to be, to the point that others have made. You can create a team to focus on this, or a committee, or what have you. Higher ed is notorious for creating committees, but get people involved to help you and leverage the different units and departments on campus and different stakeholders. So there's certainly ways to address this in a different way than we've tried in the past. But I firmly believe that if we're going to try to change something here across all spectrums of diversity, inclusion, and discrimination, we've got to do something different. And that is going to require probably a few more dollars in some cases.
Well, y'all, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I know we could go for another couple hours having this conversation. So I want to wrap us up here and thank everybody for joining today. But a huge thank you to our panelists for this discussion and your insights. Just a reminder that you can find this webinar on demand later this afternoon on CoSIDA.com and on CoSIDA's YouTube channel. It is also going to be in a podcast format. All the links to this will be on the CoSIDA.com website. All the on-demand options are free of charge. Again, thank you all for joining us today. A reminder that part 2 of our LGBTQ+ inclusion initiatives and college athletics webinar will take place at 1 p.m. Eastern next Tuesday, September 29th, where we'll hear from former and current student athletes. Next week's moderator will be George Washington University's Director of Athletics, Tanya Vogel. We hope to see you then.